This is chapter 10 of a book called The Rebirth of Rhetoric from 1992. And it's a chapter called A Rhetoric of Reading by James E. Seitz. And this is going to be a very important uh, uh, entryway into the method that we're calling the Rhetoric of Reading, hence the title. And so here we go. 1. One of the most salient advances of contemporary theory lies in its recognition of the rhetoricity in all writing, even fiction. But to what extent have theorists speculated on a rhetoric of reading? The question may at first seem strange, since rhetoric, understood as the art of persuasion, appears naturally to align itself with that which does the persuading, the writer or the text. But a model which grants all activity to the text and reduces the reader to a mere passivity does a serious injustice to the actual shaping of meaning which occurs in the dramatic exchange that constitutes reading. Whether or not we go as far as Stanley Fish, who claims that the reader creates everything in the textual encounter, most of us now recognize that the role of the reader's participation in the creation of meaning, cannot be ignored. Therefore, the time appears ripe for a model of reading that would conceive of the reader not only as receiver but as producer of what we commonly call rhetorical stance. In the Rhetoric of Fiction, Booth contends that all fictional texts suggest an implied author, with whom the reader connects in the course of reading. The implied author of each novel is someone with whose beliefs on all subjects I must largely agree, if I am to enjoy his work. Of course, the same distinction must be made between myself as reader and the very different self who goes about paying bills, repairing leaky faucets, and failing in generosity and wisdom. It is only as I read that I become the self whose beliefs must coincide with the author's. One advantage to Booth's view of reading is its conception of both author and reader as inhabited by multiple selves or roles which are called into play as the occasion demands. The implied author, an author who possesses a system of values indicated by the text, addresses the implied reader, a reader whom the text needs to hold, at least temporarily, those same values and thereby see eye to eye with the implied author. Readers who are unable, for whatever reasons, to assume the values of the implied author will find the text less satisfactory than they would otherwise. Concerning this phenomenon, Booth quotes Walker Gibson, who claims that texts we reject are often those whose mock reader we refuse to become, a mask we refuse to put on, a role we will not play. A text whose values we cannot accept, we evaluate negatively. What this version of reading offers, then, is a reader as embedded in rhetorical stance as the author or text. Readers, after all, approach texts with their own sets of values that condition their experience of those texts. Values that limit or qualify the kinds of mock readers they can become. Booth claims that this is in fact the case with his own disregard for Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover, a book whose belief in sex as the key to salvation he cannot accept, as he candidly comments. Whether I should blame myself or Lawrence for this, I can never be quite sure. Perhaps we are both partly at fault. Even if I cannot resist blaming him, at least a little, it is difficult to know whether his failure to carry me along is a failure of craftsmanship or a fundamental incompatibility that no amount of craftsmanship could overcome. It appears that readers serve not only as addressees, but that readers themselves address the text through their dispositions towards the mock or implied readers they are asked to enact. If rhetoric is defined broadly as the relationship one assumes between oneself and the addressed, then the reader's response to the text constitutes a rhetorical act, an inscription, as it were, of the reading. Readers attempt to convince the text and themselves that it has presented itself in the very way they have read it. My suggestion that readers contribute their own implicit rhetoric goes a step further than Booth does in his essentially modest description of the rhetorical situation. But my proposal is not intended to be an echo of recent claims that the reader alone writes the text, for I wish to respect the sense in which the text arrives before the reader already written. Otherwise, there would be nothing to read. Nevertheless, writing is always, in some sense, provisional, always in need of reading. And my point is that reading requires a rhetorical positioning similar to that assumed in conversation. Reading, like dialogue, constitutes a form of social engagement which consists of both reception and participation, a notion for which Pratt convincingly argues in her description of the literary speech situation, wherein both writer and reader rely on an established role structure commonly understood to be in force. Readers, for instance, accept the imposition of giving up the floor, as an audience does for a speaker, with the understanding that they have the right to interpret, respond, and evaluate. In other words, it is not only writers but also readers who eventually have their turn, their reactions, their opportunity to speak. In this turn, which interestingly echoes the turn of tropes and figures, lies what I want to recognize as a rhetoric of reading. But before considering the rhetorical predicament of the reader, we must examine how the rhetoric of the writer is already a reading.